Even before the front in Europe came to a close, Allied forces were trying to get an accurate picture of events that transpired on the Eastern Front to figure out what the strengths and weaknesses of the Soviet doctrine were in case the Soviets decided to continue their blitzkrieg into the rest of Europe. As the Soviets were naturally unwilling to share their information with the Allied forces, the Allies turned to the people who had fought the Soviets for 4 long years, the Germans. The Allies commissioned many German officers to give reports and to write memoirs of their experiences on the Eastern Front. Unfortunately, the Americans basically took them for their word and did no fact-checking on what the German officers wrote, leading to a false narrative of the war in the East and of the German armed forces in general during the Second World War, which has only started to be challenged since the fall of the Soviet Union. In this video, we will look at 4 of the most prominent myths of the German post-war narrative. You've most likely seen many videos of smiling and waving German soldiers sitting on the backs of tanks and other armored vehicles as they race past the camera. These videos only represent a small faction of the German army. After all, they are propaganda pieces and are filmed to present a certain view which sees the German army being made entirely of tank columns and soldiers not far behind in half-tracks. This, however, is a myth. The German army relied heavily on horses to move their soldiers from point A to point B in every campaign they fought. Although armor does come in and take over a lot of these roles later in the war as the number of tanks increased and the number of horses decreased, they were still a vital part of the German war effort. The Germans started the war with less than 4,000 tanks and over 500,000 horses in September of 1939, with 3,000 tanks and 750,000 horses going into the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. The idea that Hitler made all the military decisions that caused the German defeat in World War II was one that was created and fanned by German generals in their post-war memoirs, most infamous of them being Lost Victories by the German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. The book is, to say the least, extremely unreliable and clearly served primarily to cover over Manstein's political affections with Hitler and war crimes committed by forces under his command. In Lost Victories, he also took credit for victories by generals who had conveniently died and blamed his own losses on other generals and on Hitler himself. Franz Halder, chief of the German Army High Command, or OKH, was also a large factor in creating this myth along with the clean Wehrmacht myth, which we will look at further on in the video. He co-wrote The German Army from 1920 to 1945, which was a memorandum which exempted the Wehrmacht from war crimes. Due to the threat of the Soviet Union, in 1950 the Himmerod Memorandum was written, which stated the war criminals were to be released and that the public perception of the army was to change as the US wanted to rearm West Germany. Don't get me wrong, Hitler made many oversights in military management, especially later on in the war, mainly with his handling of D-Day and other counter-operations such as the Battle of the Bulge, though his overriding of generals, at least in earlier years, was quite uncommon as the German army was quite decentralized at this time. Here are 3 of the Hitler made all the bad decisions myths and why they are wrong. During the German invasion of France in 1940, Hitler has been heavily criticized post-war for supposedly halting the advance of German soldiers into the town of Dunkirk. The order to halt was actually given by Generals von Kruger and Brunstedt, not that an advance into the town and beach would do them any good due to their severe lack of ammunition, supplies, food, and sleep. Hitler also receives a lot of flack for deciding to invade the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. Firstly, the OKH agreed with Hitler on invading the USSR on 3 levels. On a practicality level, the Ukraine and Caucasus regions held much land, farms, and oil fields, all of which were desperately needed by Germany and the occupied territories to keep the population fed as well as the army fueled up. From a political level, it also makes sense as the Nazis wanted to destroy so-called Judeo-Bolshevism, which had originated in Russia. They also wanted to exterminate the millions of Slavs and other so-called undesirables who occupied much of the Soviet Union. From a military level, it also makes sense, as although Stalin was expecting a German invasion, he estimated, or more accurately hoped, it would come a year later. Although the Germans had more tanks, artillery, and aircraft than the Soviets, German economic ministers realized that the Soviet industry would quickly overtake that of the Germans. Thus, Hitler decided to take the initiative whilst he held it. However, once the invasion is underway, Hitler and his generals come to a disagreement on what the objective of the entire campaign should actually be. Hitler doesn't want to go to Moscow as he wants to focus on the Ukraine and the Caucasus, while many of his officers want to push on to Moscow. While looking at it from a chessboard view, Hitler seems to be in the wrong. If you take the capital, then the enemy will surrender. However, this did not work for Napoleon, as he had to leave Moscow basically right after capturing it, due to the inhabitants burning the city to the ground. Although it would be a political loss and a morale drop, Soviet industry had already been moved to the Urals and as far as Kazakhstan. The Russians were ready for the Germans to take Moscow and had made preparations for if it had happened. If the Germans had occupied Moscow, they certainly wouldn't have held it for long, let alone long enough to cause a significant difference to anything. In fact, Hitler is in the right when it comes to Case Blue, the German summer offensive of 1942, which aimed to reach Baku in Azerbaijan and capture all the oil fields in the Caucasus region. Halder, who is in charge of the operation, manipulates Hitler's order and gives the majority of supplies to Army Group Center when Army Group South really needs him the most. This operation would eventually spiral into the Battle of Stalingrad, leading to the defeat and surrender of the 6th German Army in the city. This would be seen largely as the turning point of the Eastern Front. Hitler also disagreed with Operation Citadel or the Battle of Kursk, stating that, "Every time I think of Operation Citadel, my stomach churns." Even though Hitler did eventually go along with the operation, this does show that at times when Hitler was making decisions, his generals sometimes agreed with him. When he went along with his generals, they sometimes failed, and when his overriding of his generals would have sometimes led to the best outcome for Germany. The myth of the Wehrmacht being apolitical implies that both the command structure and more so the individual soldier were apolitical, only fighting to defend their homeland and their families, not caring at all for the Nazi Party or their ideologies. Let's say that you're born in Germany in 1921. Hitler takes power in 1933 when you're 12 and are starting to look at the world around you as something more than a playground, looking at ideas, let alone ones thrust down your throat constantly by your school and the government. At age 14, you join the Hitler Youth, which becomes mandatory, replacing all other youth groups. For the next 4 years, you're taught not only how to fire rifles, but how your race is superior to all others. Not only how to throw grenades, but how Nazism was inseparable from war, and how you'll fight a holy war, not only for the good of Germany, but for all of Europe and mankind. When you join the German military, you swear not allegiance to Germany, nor to the Constitution, but to Hitler himself.
Des Deutschen Reiches und Volkes, Adolf Hitler!
Though war crimes were committed by the German army on the Western Front, they were not carried out by the numbers or level of brutality that they were in the East. Shortly before the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, orders known as criminal orders were created, establishing how the German soldier was to act when encountering prisoners of war and enemy civilians. The two most infamous of these orders were the Barbarossa Decree, which allowed the execution of civilians, and the Commissar Order, which allowed the execution of Soviet commissars, political officers within the army, and even regular soldiers who were deemed to be under the same standards. Both orders were received eagerly by the army, with the commander of the 12th Infantry Division saying, "The carrying of information is mostly done by youngsters between the ages of 11 to 14, and that, as the Russian is more afraid of the truncheon than of weapons, flogging is the most advisable measure for interrogation." As of the response of the army to the Commissar Order, the historian Hans Adolf Jakobson wrote the following: "There was never any doubt within the minds of the German army commanders that the order deliberately flouted international law. 90% of German units carried it out." On the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, German Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner declared, "The German army captured over 3 million prisoners of war during Operation Barbarossa. 2 million will be dead by February of 1942. Soldiers also received booklets known as Guidelines for the Behavior of the Troops, which instructed that the elimination of quote-unquote Bolshevik agitators, snipers, saboteurs, and Jews will be carried out in the Soviet Union. The German army also actively participated in the Holocaust. The outcries from German Commander Johannes Blaskowitz over the treatment and execution of Jews by the SS and Einsatzgruppen in Poland was a minority voice. The German army either aided the paramilitary groups in executing Jews, Slav, gypsies, and other minority groups, and in some cases carried out executions by themselves. In late September of 1941, SS and German soldiers executed over 30,000 Jews from Kiev at Babi Yar in 2 days. However, the picture painted by German military leaders during the war, such as Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein, shows a very different story. Shortly before the opening of hostilities, the OKW sent an order direct to all corps and divisions concerning the treatment that was to be given to the civilian population and to prisoners of war in Russia. It specified that in the event of excesses, his words, being committed against civilians or prisoners, the responsible soldier was not automatically to be tried and punished according to military law. Disciplinary action was only to be taken at the discretion of the man's immediate unit commander. I forbade its forwarding to the division and ordered that it be returned to Berlin. This order was consequently never carried out in my panzer group. The equally notorious so-called Commissioner Order also never reached my panzer group. No doubt Army Group Center had already decided not to forward it. Therefore, the Commissioner Order was never carried out by my troops either. Von Manstein also spoke about the Commissar Order in his memoir, Lost Victories. I had no alternative but to inform my Piprions that the Commissar Order would not be implemented by anyone under my command. My subordinate commanders were entirely at one with me on this, and everyone in the Corps area acted accordingly. Before he said this, Manstein said that if he had ordered the execution of commissars, then it would have been justified. Manstein also conveniently leaves out the fact that while he was commander of German forces in the Crimea, his troops aided the Einsatzgruppen in murdering up to 100,000 Jews. After the war, he faced charges including not preventing murders in his command area, shooting Soviet war prisoners, carrying out the Commissar Order, and allowing subordinates to shoot Soviet civilians in reprisals. During the capture and occupation of the Latvian town Leipzig, the Kriegsmarine took control. Korvetten Captain Stein, the superior officer in the town, ordered that along with the deportation or execution of all Jews in the area, 10 hostages taken from among the population were to be shot in retaliation for every act of sabotage carried out by the Red Army bandits who were still at large in Latvia. Heinz Wilhelm Elk, the commander of German submarine 852, was tried and executed post-war with 2 of his sailors for shooting at the survivors of the Greek ship Peleus in 1944. This was the only confirmed unprovoked shooting of survivors of shipwrecks documented, so we have no idea if more acts like X were committed. Strategic bombing, or terror bombing, was a tactic first employed by the Germans in the First World War with the use of Zeppelin and Gotha aircraft. Though these attacks were incredibly small in scale, with the advancement of technology, the potential for aircraft to aid in waging war increased. The Germans first used strategic bombing en masse in Spain during the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939. Hundreds were killed in the bombing of Guernica by the Condor Legion in 1937. Strategic bombing was first used in World War II by the Germans from day one by the Luftwaffe against Polish cities. Most notorious was the bombing of the capital of Warsaw. Though the bombing was deemed militarily ineffective, it killed up to 7,000 people and was a key factor in the surrender of Polish soldiers within the city. The Germans also put whistles on their bombs and Jericho trumpets on their Stuka dive bombers, which creates the iconic screaming sound effect. Both these modifications had no military value, and if anything decreased the value of the attack, alerting those below that they were about to be bombed. These additions were made to bombs and aircraft for the pure terror tactics alone. During the invasion of France in the Low Countries in the summer of 1940, towns were targeted from the air along with packed streets filled with civilians trying to flee the oncoming German army. Rotterdam, a city in the Netherlands, was also completely destroyed after an ultimatum to the Dutch government concerning surrender was not met. The Dutch High Command surrendered after the bombing, and 800 civilians were killed. However, these bombings pale in comparison to the terror bombings that occurred on the Eastern Front. Many cities, most famously along them Leningrad and Stalingrad, were bombed to mere pieces of rubble. Over 800,000 civilians would die in both these cities during the conflict. What separates these bombings from those in France and Britain is that they were not just strategic bombings in the eyes of the Germans, but racial ones. The Luftwaffe didn't just play a vital role in the German campaigns during World War II, it also aided greatly in the war of extermination. This was quite a heavy video to both research and write, not only because of the content involved, but also because there are many people out there who believe in these myths that I have stated. Though it is pretty harmless to believe that the German army was a completely modern force or that the Tiger tank was the best tank of the war, it is not only untrue to believe that the Wehrmacht did not engage in war crimes, let alone was spotless, but dangerous.